This is the audiobook for Imperfect Likeness, The Legend of Frank Matsura, by Dan Sato, read by the author. Part 1, Alaska, 1901. Chapter 1. Emerging from the dark, stinking hold into the cool air and brilliant Alaskan sunlight made me think for the first time in weeks that I had not made a terrible mistake. Maybe this would turn out to be all right after all. Maybe I hadn't compounded my bad luck with an act of hubris. Stepping up to the top of the gangplank and squinting in the light, I struggled with the trunk that carried all my possessions, including my cameras and glass plates swaddled in clothing. I paused a moment to establish my balance before stepping down the gangplank to the dock in my smooth-bottomed shoes. The farmer behind me shoved me. "Hurry up, samurai!" He stank like a barnyard animal, but so did we all. I walked down the gangplank with quick, steady steps so that I would not slip. It swayed a little with the movement of the ship. Once on the dock, I set my trunk down with a thump because forward movement had stopped. We gathered in a cluster, blocked by a knot of men arguing about what to do. Some said they should walk down the dock to the shore, which seemed the sensible thing. But another man argued that they should wait for instructions and was gesticulating violently. Other men shouted their opinions. At the shore end of the dock, there stood a desk behind which sat a uniformed man. He was beckoning and calling, but he was too far to be heard over the noise of the arguing men, the rushing crew shouting to one another, and the screeching of gulls diving at a crate that had broken as it was being lowered to the dock. A sailor waved his hands at the birds and shouted. Their screeches sounded like laughter, mocking the man's efforts at waving them away. Surrounding it all, the Pacific Ocean hissed and crashed. Up ahead, the arguing men had begun shoving one another. Lord in heaven, was there no one in charge? I looked around me. I had made it to America. Alaska was not a state, but it had been American territory for over 30 years. My first goal had been achieved. Get there. Next, get money and make some exposures worthy of the master. The argument on the dock resolved, and the line of failed farmers, fugitives, and foolhardy emigrants started moving again down the boards bleached by sun and salt towards the land. The man at the desk was inspecting everyone's papers, writing on and stamping them. Beyond him, on the pebbly shore, stood a man in a white shirt and black vest, shouting at the men who had passed immigration inspection. I could not make out what he was saying, but it did not matter. The men could not understand him. It was babble. Waiting my turn, I looked back at the SS Tsarevich, rocking gently at the dock. It had brought us over the violent, angry sea, the distinctly misnamed Pacific Ocean, thrusting upward and back down again over and over until half the men had vomited onto the floor of the windowless china hold where we slept, 20 inches above and below another bunk for 28 days. From the dock, the ship looked massive, like a city block floating on the water, its smokestack thrusting upward towards the sun. Yet the hold in which we had been confined had seemed as cramped and miserable as a dungeon. At the inspection desk, I lied, as we had all been coached to do. I did not have a job waiting for me, I said, but I was headed for the cannery because I had heard there was work there. I had my own money and would not become a public charge. The inspector looked at me, surprised at my English. Most of the other Japanese could manage no more than a barely intelligible "no jobu," got money. It was a charade. The men could not understand the questions asked in English, and the inspector could not understand the garbled replies. The cannery had paid our head tax, so it was obvious we were contracted to work there. Still, every man was approved. My papers were stamped, U.S. Immigration Service, approved May 25, 1901, Sitka, Alaska. I then walked past a white-coated doctor who barely glanced at me. I sat my trunk on the shoreline. I could then hear the man in the white shirt and the black vest. He was still shouting and had begun gesturing. He was telling them to walk this way and to load their belongings on a cart that was waiting on the road. His face and hair were red. He spoke English with a strange accent, so I could not understand every word. But I understood enough, and raising my voice, translated for him, pointing to the road and telling them, "Nimotsu o kuruma ni nosete." All heads turned towards me when I did so. I knew what they saw when they looked at me. A short young man in a black suit, a black tie, white shirt with a 2-inch collar, and a bowler hat. I looked like what I was, a school teacher. Yet, despite the quality of my clothing, I was as grimy as they were. I was as hungry as they were. I'd never been this hungry before, not even in the army, and wondered when we would be fed. My hunger was like an insistent voice that would not shut up. The white man beckoned for me. I approached, dragging my trunk up the shore, leaving a grooved path behind me. You speak English?" "Yes, sir. And Japanese." "Of course, I am a Japanese." The man spoke in a buoyant rhythm. "Tell those men going to the Red Gold Packing Company that the cart will be brought to a smaller steamship and loaded. Their baggage will be returned to them after they've reached the cannery. They will make the rest of the trip on that second ship." I stepped up onto my trunk and shouted my translation using the slow, authoritative voice I had used with my pupils. After a moment of uncertainty, the men began moving towards the road and began working as a team, lifting and loading the bags and cases, organizing so that the wooden chests and heavy trunks did not crush the flimsy pressed paper cases. The furoshiki bundles were piled on the side. With my translation, things began progressing in an orderly way. I hadn't been sure they would follow my directions, but they did. It felt at once natural and uncomfortable, giving orders to this class of men. In Japan, most of them would have bowed to me and done whatever I asked, but I was done with that. The Japanese bunkhouse was a ramshackle barracks that smelled of fish and human bodies. I would have preferred to sleep in an army tent outside in the cool salt air, but I followed the others as we were herded in. Immediately, men started claiming bunks near the stove or the window or door, calling to each other in their twangy country accents. I slid my trunk under a lower bunk that looked unclaimed. The mattresses were stained, and there was no makura for one's head, but that was all right. I could roll up some of my clothing for that. A scratchy-looking wool blanket was folded at the foot of the bed. A man with a thick body and thick, dirty fingers, ungroomed hair, and an unshaven face came up and stood next to me as I sat on my bunk. "The top bunk is mine," he said in a voice that is half grunt, half earthquake. "That's fine," I said. I dipped my head in a bow-like gesture. "I've had it for 3 weeks. It's mine." "Fine, fine. The top bunk is yours." "I'm Matsura from Tokyo." He looked me over. "All right, Matsura from Tokyo. Taku from Yokohama." He did not bow, and he spoke to me like we were familiar with one another, without the respectful language many others on the ship had used towards me. Back home, this would have been seen as unforgivable, but I was grateful. On the ship, many had viewed me with suspicion. Some had said I was a spy for the company or a debt collector or something. Others were obsequious, hoping to gain some advantage through association with me. I hated that. "You some kind of rich man?" he asked, flicking my tie. "If I was rich, would I be here?" I asked. He grunted his acknowledgement of this fact. "I'm here to work," I said, "just like you." He poked my trunk with his bare foot. "If this is valuable, whatever it is, hide it." He gestured towards the others with a jerk of his head. "Thieves." "It's my cameras. I'm a photographer. Do you know about photographs?" "Yes, sounds valuable. Maybe I'll steal it." I couldn't tell if he was joking. "Is there going to be food?" I asked. "Yeah, in the mess hall, but it's shit. There's better food in the company store." "When? I'm hungry." "Pretty soon." He got up and climbed onto the top bunk, stepping on my bed. After our meal, chipped beef in a salty gravy on top of a large quantity of potatoes, I was summoned to the office of the cannery's superintendent, Mr. Anderson. I didn't want to go. I was still exhausted from the ocean passage and just wanted to rest. But in his office, furnished with a scrolled wooden desk and brass inkwell, he told me that he had learned from the foreman that I could speak English and said I could be useful when it came to communicating with the Japs. He was a young man, fair-complexioned, with fine features. I stood before him, my hat in my hands. "Where did you learn your English? Missionaries?" asked Mr. Anderson in a distinct accent I would later learn was Norwegian. "No, sir, I had a teacher at university, an American." "At university?" "Yes, sir. My uncle sent me to university to learn English, German, literature, and philosophy. He has a school. I trained to be a teacher." I could hear that my English pronunciation was a little sloppy and sharpened up my L's and R's. He asked what sorts of things had been part of my education. I told him. "You've read Shakespeare and Aristotle?" His face was frozen with incredulity. He pronounced his R the same way Japanese did. "The classics in translation, sir." I struggled with the triple consonants. "My Greek is bad, but the Shakespeare in English." Mr. Anderson slapped his thigh. "Yes, that's remarkable. What did you say your name was?" "Sakai Matsura." I said my given name first and my surname second so as not to confuse him. "Matsura," he repeated. "What the devil are you doing here?" "I would like to work here, sir. I'm a hard worker." Of course. But what are you equipped to do?" "I can learn to work in the salmon cannery. I learn quickly." "Of that I have no doubt." He scratched his temple. "But I can't have an educated man work the line. I have another purpose for you. Would you be willing to translate for my foreman? It's hard to get workers to do what you need them to do when you don't speak the same language." "Would that be all? Just translate?" No, we wouldn't need that every day, but I can't have a civilized man who reads Shakespeare chopping the guts out of salmon." Mr. Anderson paused. "The valued file distinguishes the swift, the slow, the subtle. Recognize that? Isn't that Macbeth?" He guffawed with pleasure. "Very good, you're a real scholar." I smiled but wondered whether his choice of quote was appropriate. After all, Macbeth was talking to men he was hiring to murder his friend. Mr. Anderson asked about my religious affiliation and was pleased to hear that I was a fellow Protestant, a Presbyterian. He was a Lutheran himself, he said. "You'll work in the company store, and Sunday come to supper with me and Mrs. Anderson. She'll be very interested to meet you." And that's how I came to work at the company store. It was easy work compared to the grueling cannery work I heard described by the others. The person who had been doing that job was an Italian named Giuseppe, or Joe as he preferred. He was Italian from a fishing village that was 3 hours from Napoli by donkey cart. I told Joe he was a long way from home, farther than me. The opposite side of the world. If I went any more far, I'd be headed back to Italy. But now Joe planned to move to Sitka and open a general store. I was his replacement. He explained how the store operated. The men were advanced scrip, representing the pay they would receive at the end of the fishing season. They could use the scrip to buy things at the company's store. But it was a racket, he said, to take the company's workers' payback. The prices at the store were inflated, and the scrip wasn't worth anything anywhere else. And even if it had been, there was no other store for 200 miles. And by the end of the season, many men found that they had spent their entire pay in advance on cigarettes, Crown Pilot bread, clothing, and boxed food. "It's a dirty scheme," Joe said. "Those men worked and received no pay. That's like slavery, no?" he asked me. I had to agree. He showed me the ledger and cash box, told me about the infrequent deliveries of goods that came in huge quantities that became a storage problem. He told me to set traps for the rats. At this, I clenched my jaw. Rats frighten and disgust me. He also warned me to never give merchandise on credit, even if someone begged for it, because then a worker would reach the end of the season and actually owe the company money. And if he owed money, he'd have to keep working for nothing until he paid off his debt. And that really was slavery. When evening came and we closed the store, he left. I never saw Joe again. I guessed he'd been waiting for someone to relieve him, like a soldier on watch. He left behind a postcard of Mount Vesuvius, so I tacked it up on the wall in case he ever came back for a visit. Taku and some of the other men were sitting around playing cards, Hanafuda, the flower card game. I asked if I could join them. Some of them looked uncomfortable with the idea, but I told a few jokes, lost some money, and after a while they became more relaxed around me. I was soon more or less accepted. Tolerated, at least. I asked what it was like working on the line. "Shitty," Taku said, "and dangerous." They explained the process. The fishing scows come in with their catch. The men hoist them up to the cannery deck. That's called brailing, young Kenta said, and spill them onto the floor, sometimes as many as 80,000 fish from one scow, a trawler usually. Sometimes the salmon are knee-deep, Kenta said. Kenta's arms were thin, but the raised sinews in them looked as strong as steel cables. "That's right, sensei," Ito said with a cutting tone. Ito, a thin nasal man who avoided eye contact with me, liked to call me sensei, but not with respect or friendliness. It was sarcastic, mocking. They all knew I worked at the store. "Slippery, easy to fall," said Taku. They would feed the fish onto a belt where they were gutted, I was told. Then they chopped off the fish heads and cut off the tail and fins. The heads and guts were thrown down a hole in the floor into the water below. That's why gulls and sharks were always under the dock, Ueno, an older man, said. Then the fish went to be slimed, which was done in a shallow saltwater tank. That's where the fish were washed of their slime. Fish are slippery, right? That's the slime. No one liked working at the slime table. Then they were descaled. They got filleted by a gang with sharp knives. "Shh, shh, shh, done," said Matsumoto, a portly man. 5 seconds, done. Sometimes a man on the fillet team would cut his hand and get blood on the fish, but it didn't matter because salmon is red already, so who would notice? "Unless the cut is bad," said Ueno, a cigarette dangling from his lips, "then you have to wash and bandage it. But then you slowed the line so the foreman screams at you." At the next station, the salmon was cut up, put into cans by hand, and weighed. If they were too heavy, they took some out. If they were too light, they put a few pieces in. Then someone salted the fish and sent them to the machine operated by 2 men that soldered on the lids. Next, the finished cans were sent by a 4-man team into the retort to be cooked. When the cans came out steaming and hot, they were rinsed in lye, labeled, and packed for shipping. The lye tank was a good and bad job, they said. It's clean. You don't have to touch the fish or the cans at all, but the lye is dangerous. A man was blinded the previous year when the tank splashed him in the face. "We ship 350,000 cans a season," said Ueno. I was tired just listening to that whole process. And during the busiest time of the season, they did this 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. "I'm a fisherman," said Taku abruptly. "I didn't come here to gut fish all day. That's women's work." It was true that in Japan the woman would clean the fish in the kitchen before cooking it. Men caught the fish and brought it home. "I came here thinking I was going to work on a fishing scow," he continued. The other men set their cards down aside. This was his familiar grievance. "I'm a fisherman. I worked on my father's fishing boat in Yokohama since I was a little boy." The men said in unison, "Sagami Bay." "That's right, Sagami Bay. I'm a wasted resource," he said, slapping his cards down. "I should be hoisting a net or trimming a sail, not gutting salmon all day, every day. You know, even scrubbing a deck is better than this. I'm a man." "We're all men," said Matsumoto, "but this is the job. We do the job and then we go back home with money. More money than we ever could have gotten there." "No money there," said Ueno. "But at least there," Taku began. The argument was interrupted by Chen, a Chinese who sometimes came over from the Chinese bunkhouse to gamble with the Japanese. I didn't like the look of him. Dressed in indigo-dyed sam and fu, he had come to tell Taku that his woman was at the door. Sure enough, standing in the door to the bunkhouse was an Indian woman in a shirt made of spotted leather. She did not step through the door. Taku made a noise indicating his irritation, then got up and walked over to her with heavy, thumping footsteps. They spoke, but I couldn't hear their words. Were they speaking Japanese? Some Indian language? I couldn't tell. But then Taku burst out in an angry exclamation of some kind. He raised his hand and the woman stepped back so I could no longer see her. It looked like he was going to strike her. His voice carried the threat of violence. But in a moment she was gone and the door closed. That night after lights out, I quietly asked about the woman. Ha, her name is Ha. I told her not to come here, but she doesn't listen. Why shouldn't she come here? This bunkhouse is for Japanese. I told her to stay away, but she came anyway. Japanese women will do what you say, not Indian women. I said neutrally. I could think of several instances in which a Japanese woman had not obeyed her husband's command. At my uncle's school, more than one mother had enrolled her daughter over the objections of her husband. Where does she live? He gestured vaguely. Over there, with her people. Does he work at the cannery? I asked. What's it to you? He demanded. Nothing, I said. Nothing. And dropped it.